Certainly, Your Honor. Mr. Wagner, when we left off yesterday, we were talking about your involvement in the investigation, and I'd like to just kind of recap a little bit your recollection of how you became involved, how you came to be here to testify against Mr. Blahnik. You told us that you were questioned on February 23rd, 2019 at your home. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you were later questioned at the Sheriff's Office on February 27. Is that right?
That is correct as well.
All right. And then you later were participating in what's called a proffer, P-R-O-F-F-E-R, interview under oath with the prosecution. Is that right?
That is correct.
That was in,
there were two of those, I believe.
Yeah, January 2020, your first one?
Correct.
Then you had a second proffer interview in March of 2020.
That is correct as well.
Now, again, the proffer interviews were part of an agreement that you, your lawyer, and the government had negotiated where the things that you said during those proffers would not be used against you. Correct?
Correct.
And the two proffers in January and March of 2020 were under oath. That means you'd been sworn to tell the truth.
Correct.
You were indicted in this case in October 2019. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
And as a part of the indictment, you were provided with what are called minutes of evidence or minutes of the testimony that the grand jurors had heard in returning that indictment.
Was that a question?
That is.
Was I?
Yeah, were you provided with minutes of testimony or minutes of evidence?
Were I given them? Is that what you were asking, or was that?
I beg your pardon?
I'm sorry, I'm confused by your question. Was I given the minutes of testimony? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, you received those as part of the indictment, didn't you?
Maybe. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. Well, in any event, you were given a summary of what witnesses had said before the grand jury.
Okay.
And that included what Mr. Blahnik had said to the grand jurors, what Mr. Hoff had said to the grand jurors, what the police had said to the grand jurors, correct?
Was that given to my lawyer? Is that what?
Yeah, and you got a copy from your lawyer.
I never believe I had a copy. I didn't want a copy of it. But I believe my lawyer did have a copy. Correct. But I would never have one in my possession.
Well, you were furnished information about what Mr. Blahnik had said. You were furnished information about what Mr. Hoff had said during the investigation.
Okay.
That's right, isn't it?
To an extent, correct.
So, we know, of course, that when you were first interviewed by the police, you denied that you knew anything. You said you didn't know anything. That's true, isn't it?
No, when at my house, I had told them that the defendant had stabbed him in self-defense.
Eventually you did say that. That's right. And what I'd like to turn to now is what happened on December 13, December 14, before you went over to Paul Hoff's trailer, okay?
Okay.
Now, you told the men and women of the jury yesterday, I think, that your purpose in going over there was to kill Chris Bagley. Is that accurate?
Yes.
But earlier you had told investigators that the reason that you went over to Mr. Hoff's trailer because Mr. Blahnik wanted you to ask if Mr. Hoff had any cocaine.
That is correct.
And you said that in the early investigation, in fact, in the proffer in in January of 2020, that not only did Mr. Blahnik ask you to call about getting cocaine, but you called Mr. Hoff, and he said, yeah, that he would get that for you, and he would also talk to you about a large order. You remember that?
Yes, the large order was pertaining to marijuana.
Okay. So he told you during his phone call that Mr. Bagley was there with him.
That is correct. That is probably the second thing he said when we spoke.
Now, you also told investigators, didn't you, that Mr. Blahnik had said that when he learned that Mr. Bagley was at Hoff's trailer, that that's good because he owed Mr. Bagley some money.
I found that out later as they were at the trailer. I don't believe he knew they were at the trailer. He just knew they were together. We did not know they were at the trailer until I made the phone call.
But in fact, you told investigators back in February of 2019 that Mr. Blahnik asked you for a ride to Paul Hoff's because he either had to get some money from Chris or he owed some money to Chris.
That's what I told them at the time, yes.
That's what you told the investigators?
That's correct.
You also told investigators that you and Mr. Blahnik didn't know that Chris Bagley was at the Hoff trailer until that phone call when Hoff told you that Bagley was there.
Correct. We did not know he was at the trailer.
You also told the prosecutors during the January 2020 interview or proffer, after you talked to your lawyer, Mr. Brown, that the real reason you went over to the Hoff house was to hurt Chris Bagley.
That is correct.
And it took some prodding from your lawyer to get you to tell what your intention was.
Correct.
In your March 2020 proffer with the government lawyers, you again, through your lawyer, told the government lawyers that you needed to correct your testimony, that you had to straighten some things out.
That's true.
Because you hadn't been forthcoming and truthful with them in January.
I hadn't been 100% forthcoming or 100% truthful. That is correct.
So in March of 2020, you told the government that you were told to make the phone call to try to see if Chris was over there because you thought, or rather, because Mr. Blahnik thought that Bagley was avoiding him.
Correct.
And you also told the investigators, the prosecution in March of 2020, that one of the girls had called Blahnik, or Blahnik had called one of the girls and told him that Chris and Paul were together.
I told them that I thought that. I just told them that I had known that the defendant had heard from a female that they were together. Whether it was a phone call or a Snapchat, it became evident somehow through the evening that there had been contact made from the defendant with a female, and I believe that's how he had found out they were together.
In fact, Mr. Wagner, when you told the prosecutors about assuming that Mr. Blahnik had heard from one of the girls, you never, ever used the term bitch, did you?
Not at that time, but that is how he referred to them as. And you say one of the girls. I don't know which one you're speaking of. He never said a specific name.
So who did you tell among the prosecution team that he had used the term bitch?
That is a term that he used. I wasn't trying to use a derogatory term for female.
Who did you tell that to?
I said it the other day when I was speaking 100% truthfully, and I asked if I was supposed to speak in the exact term, And so that's where the term bitch came from.
That term never appears in the transcript of your interview on March 30th.
Well, when we start getting into specifics of what is specifically said, that was the term that he was used, so that is the term that I am relaying to you and the jury.
Well, Mr. Wagner, you appeared in March 30th to correct some earlier testimony that you had given that was false, and I'm sure you were asked about all the specifics that you knew about this interaction with Mr. Blahnik, and you never ever used the term bitch, did you?
Correct. The specifics that we were trying to clear up were the things that I had knowingly misled or were scared to reveal, and the word bitch was not high on my list of priorities to clear up at the time.
Well, and that was also the first time you said anything about Mr. Blahnik being aware of Bagley being at Hoff's trailer through some woman.
That is correct, because I believed at the time that would probably show premeditation, which I was not trying to give up on the defendant.
So, again, in January of 2020, when you were being interviewed by the prosecution team, you told them that when Mr. Blahnik learned that Bagley was at the Hoff trailer through a phone call that you had with Hoff, Mr. Blahnik said, "Oh, good, I owe Chris $300. Is that what you told them?
That might be correct.
And then later you said, as we know after you were corrected by your lawyer, that the real reason you went over there was to beat up or hurt Mr. Bagley.
That is correct.
And you also told the prosecutors under oath in January of 2020, "I was never, ever told, hey, we're going over here to kill a guy." That's what you told them.
That is what I told them at the time. Correct.
Then in March of 2020, you again said under oath that you called to ask for cocaine, but really the reason was to see if Bagley was there.
That is 100% correct.
And then you did, as you told the men and women of the jury yesterday, that your real reason was to go over there with the intention of killing Mr. Bagley.
Correct.
Now, that wasn't the original plan, though, was it?
That was the original plan.
Well, the original plan was not to kill Mr. Bagley in the trailer, according to your testimony in March of 2020. That was the backup plan.
Backup plan?
Yes.
What did I say was the first plan?
The first one was to kill him somewhere else.
No.
Pardon me?
No.
That was not the original?
No. And I don't believe I said that at any time.
Oh. The original plan was to wait until he left the trailer to kill him.
The plan happened on the fly. The plan that the defendant made was to take him one-on-one in the front part of the trailer.
And not in the trailer.
The front part of the trailer being inside the trailer, sir.
Well, so let's turn now to what happened when you actually went in the trailer, okay?
Okay.
So you went in the trailer and you told the men and women of the jury that you saw Mr. Bagley there, you saw Paul Hoff there. At some point, you went into the back room with Mr. Hoff.
That is correct.
And when you went in the back room to talk to Mr. Hoff, you noticed that Mr. Hoff was wearing a Kevlar vest.
That is true.
A so-called bulletproof vest.
Correct.
And he was suiting up because he was going to assist in robbing the SLU crew.
That is correct.
With Mr. Bagley.
I believe so, yes.
And you told us yesterday that when you're back there in the back room with Mr. Hoff, that you told him that you were going to beat up.
I believe the term that we used, that I used was mess him up.
And by mess him up, you meant just beat him up?
I meant that Blahnik was going to handle it how he was going to handle it in the front room, and then I didn't tell him, but that if not, we were just going to jump him.
And kill him?
And beat him up at that point. He didn't get into the exact details if he was going to kill him, but I believe he knew I didn't want any part of that, So maybe to suffice me or placate me, he just told me we were going to jump him. He didn't get into the exact extent of that.
So in the back room at the Hoff trailer, did Mr. Hoff know through what you told him that your plan was to make sure that Chris Bagley was killed?
I'd object to that question, Your Honor, insofar as it calls for the witness to testify about somebody else's state of mind.
Would you repeat the question? Sorry.
I'll rephrase it. Did you tell Mr. Hoff that you were there to kill Chris Bagley?
No.
Did you tell him that you were there to mess him up?
Yes.
And he was on board with that?
100%.
In fact, he said, I'll roll with it.
Among other things.
Well, among other things, what did he say?
He also called Chris Bagley a snitch and a rat.
And this was the man that he was about ready to suit up to go commit a robbery with?
Yes, sir.
And so did he tell you he had a change of heart about that the robbery was off then?
I was trying to explain to him how it was a bad idea, how they didn't have what Chris thought they had, and I believe he was rapidly changing his mind about going to rob the salute crew.
Could you tell that Mr. Hoff was high on meth?
Absolutely. Him and Chris.
Pardon me?
Yes, him and Chris.
How could you tell that?
Just from their mannerisms. He was speaking really fast, shaky. I believe I saw a methamphetamine pipe in his pocket. He had pulled some marijuana out of his pocket, and I believe he had a methamphetamine pipe, too, as he put his hand back in his pocket.
That was Paul Hoff?
Correct.
And did you see Paul Hoff actually smoke some meth?
Not that evening, no.
Did you see Chris Bagley smoke some meth that night?
No, not that evening.
But you could tell from his behavior that he was on meth, too?
Correct.
As a matter of fact, when you came into the trailer and you saw Chris Bagley in the trailer, Mr. Bagley was getting a bunch of tactical gear together.
I saw him cleaning a gun, but you could say that he was probably suiting up to go on robberies, correct?
Well, did you tell investigators in February of 2019 that you saw Mr. Bagley with tactical gear?
What would be the tactical gear? By the tactical gear I saw would be the Kevlar vest on Paul Hoff.
Well, when you came back out of the room where you and Paul Hoff had been, Mr. Bagley had put away this gun that you saw.
I did not see the gun when I came back out, so that would be correct.
You didn't see where he had put it.
No, I did not.
And when you came out of the back room with Mr. Hoff, Drew Blahnik and Mr. Bagley were talking about money.
Correct. Something I believe is $300.
Okay. And at this point, when Mr. Bagley and Mr. Blahnik were talking about money, they were standing from your vantage point to the right of the front door.
Yes. Towards the bar.
Okay. And then the struggle between you and Mr. Bagley, you told him that he had fucking robbed enough people and that he needed to chill the fuck out.
Yes. When we were, the conversation started about the slew crew, and then it went into the robberies of Andy. And those, yes, were my terms, my words.
So you heard Mr. Bagley talk about robbing the slew crew?
Yes, I did. He was trying to talk the defendant into going with them.
And Mr. Hoff had already suited up.
Mr. Hoff was suited up.
And in response to what you said to Mr. Bagley said, you think you know everything, you're smarter than everyone else.
Yes, that's what he said.
And then you said that he was bringing heat down on people, right?
Right.
And then you told investigators in February of 2019, I'm out of here, and then you got up and left.
I told them that I left, no. I told them that I got up like I was wanting to leave.
Wanting to leave,
Correct, which is true.
even though you had this mission to kill him.
My mission at that point, when I realized that the defendant was not going to handle it one-on-one, was to try to remove myself from the situation as quickly as possible. At that point, I had realized what I'd gotten myself into and was trying to find the nearest way out.
So at that point, you were trying to extricate yourself from this plan?
Absolutely. From the time that I had left the back room with Paul Hoff, my plan was to remove myself from that situation as quickly as possible.
So did you signal to Mr. Blahnik, hey, I'm out of this?
No.
Well, in fact, you told Chris Bagley to stop what he'd been doing and stop fucking up.
Correct.
And he said to you, I'll kill you, you motherfucker.
He told me I'm not as tough as I think I am, and he said some other things, but I really didn't hear the back part of it.
In fact, Mr. Wagner, did you not say under oath on January 31, 2020, to these prosecutors, you said, Chris, stop, fucking stop, and he's like, quote, I'll kill you, motherfucker.
If you said I said it, then I said it.
Would you agree that that's what you said, sir?
If it's there, then yes.
It is there.
Okay.
So he said he was going to kill you during this encounter, and then you in response said, fuck you, motherfucker.
Once he told me that I'm not as tough as I think I am, I said, fuck you, motherfucker. Correct.
And during this encounter with Mr. Bagley, you felt threatened, didn't you?
No, not threatened. He never scared me physically.
Pardon me?
He never made me nervous or scared physically.
Well, you were in fear, weren't you?
No, if I was in fear, I would have acted in fear immediately. I let him push me first.
Well, when you were questioned in February of 2019 by Detective Buter, he asked you, did you ever fear he, meaning Mr. Bagley, was going to do something to you? And you said, yeah, well, yeah, didn't you?
I told him that because at the time I was still trying to go with the lie that the defendant acted in self-defense, so I had to be in fear of my life.
And in fact, you told Detective Buter that you were in fear because you knew that Bagley carried guns.
I told him that at the time, yes.
Well, in fact, during this encounter with Mr. Bagley in Paul Hoff's trailer, and you told us yesterday that there was a gun there, and he had a gun, right? He had a gun.
Correct.
You'd seen him with a gun,
Yes.
and then during this struggle with Mr. Bagley, after he said, I'm going to kill you, motherfucker, a gun fell to the floor.
It did not at that time.
Pardon me?
It did not at that time. We got into a shoving match.
Okay, well, during the shoving match, a gun fell to the floor.
Correct.
It wasn't your gun.
It was not my gun.
Was it the same gun that you saw him with earlier?
Yes.
And after you said, fuck you, motherfucker, and then you tried to get control of Mr. Bagley's hands so he couldn't get down and get that gun.
Not at that time. He pushed me, and then I tried to back out of the confrontation. He pushed me again, and then it was at that point that I grabbed him and threw him up against the wall and bum rushed him, charged him. I never grabbed control of his wrist, but I put my arms underneath his arms, otherwise known as underhooks, so he could not get to his gun. But I never had wrist control.
Well, to be clear, you told the men and women of the prosecution team in January of 2020 that you saw the gun hit the ground, you looked at him, meaning Bagley, you looked at the door, you looked at him, and immediately he's bending down to grab the gun.
I told them at that time, yes.
Well, that was under oath. That was true.
That was not true. I said many things at that time because I was scared and nervous for the outcome of the truth to come out of what actually happened that evening. I was still trying to save the defendant from going to prison for the rest of his life.
No. You were telling the prosecution team what you told them and represented to be the truth, didn't you?
No.
So, Mr. Wagner, getting back to this gun and what you told the prosecution had fallen to the floor and that you were trying to get control of Mr. Bagley's hands, we know there was a gun, right?
That is correct.
And you saw that it was a Ruger.
I know it was a handgun. I can't tell you whether it's a Ruger or a Glock. I'm not super versed on handguns.
Well, you may not be able to tell me it was a Ruger, but you told the police it was a Ruger, didn't you?
Well, I believe that'd be a general term for a handgun. If I used the word Ruger, I meant handgun.
And not only did you say it was a Ruger, but you described what it looked like.
Silver and black, correct.
Yeah. And this was the gun that you saw fall to the floor.
Correct.
In fact, you told the police that you thought this gun was in the back of Chris Bagley.
It was a guess from when I pushed him towards the wall and kind of where it was at in relation to the ground, that it probably fell out from behind him when he hit the wall.
Okay. And when Detective Buter was questioning you in February 27, 2019, Detective Buter told you, Drew told us that they were wrestling and Chris reached down to his waistband and grabbed it, and you replied, maybe he did, but I was locked up. Is that what you told Detective Buter?
It's possible.
Well, did you say maybe he did, but I was locked up, and then you described that the left arm, Mr. Bagley's left arm, was like behind my neck, but I don't know where the right arm was because immediately I went to go put him towards the wall.
Is this before I threw him up towards the wall? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it sounds like when you went to put him up towards the wall, his right arm was free.
No, immediately when he hit the wall, my arms immediately went underneath his arms, and I clasped my hands together so he could not get out of my grip.
Now, we know, of course, it was not uncommon for Mr. Bagley to have a gun, and you knew that.
Yes, almost all the time I saw him, he had a gun.
You told the prosecution team in January of 2020 that you heard Mr. Blahnik yell, gun, gun. That's what you told him, isn't it?
Yes.
And he did have a gun.
Yep.
And you tried to turn Mr. Bagley away from the gun.
That is correct, and that is what happened.
And you thought that it fell out of his pants when you pushed him up against the wall.
Correct.
Now, when you and Mr. Blahnik arrived at the trailer, you told the men and women of the jury that you recalled that he was armed with a knife, not with a gun.
Correct.
And this knife you described as a green army knife in a holster or sheath.
Correct.
And you saw that knife on the way over there, didn't you?
Yes, I saw it the first time that we drove and made the pass through in my vehicle.
And did you see that he had it when he went into the trailer?
I assumed that he still had the knife on him.
Okay. But that wasn't the knife that was used to kill Chris Beck?
No, it was not.
So Mr. Blahnik's knife has nothing to do with this case?
Nothing at all.
So next, I'd like to turn to what happened to Mr. Bagley's body, all right?
Okay.
Now, originally you told the investigators that you didn't know anything about how the body got out of the Hoff trailer.
Correct.
In fact, you told investigators that you had left, you'd walked out.
Right.
And is it now your testimony that somebody other than you wrapped Mr. Bagley's body up into a tarp?
Correct. I believe it was a clear plastic.
Pardon me?
Clear plastic, not a tarp.
Okay.
A tarp to me would be blue or green.
So it was clear, not blue?
Correct. Clear.
Now, you told investigators originally that you had nothing to do with it, you didn't touch the body. They asked you specifically, were you helping to load him in the truck, and you said, no, absolutely not.
That is correct. That's what I said at the time.
And in fact, you told investigators if you had moved the body, you would have told them about that.
Correct. That's what I told them.
Now, when you knew in the trailer that Mr. Bagley was dead, you told us about some effort by Mr. Hoff to look through the bag that Mr. Bagley had brought over.
Black bag, yes.
And is it your testimony that Mr. Hoff learned that Mr. Bagley was a snitch or a rat based on what he saw in the bag?
I found that out later, yes.
In talking with Mr. Hoff?
Yes.
But I mean, earlier, when you were in the back room with Mr. Hoff, he had referred to Bagley as a rat motherfucker.
A snitch and a rat, yes.
Meaning somebody who was cooperating with investigators?
Yes.
And in fact, after Mr. Bagley was dead, Hoff said, fuck that motherfucker.
Yes, he did.
He's a rat.
I believe he said he's done. When I returned later with the tools, that's when he got more in depth about what he had found in the black bag. I believe there was an investigator or U.S. Marshal's card in there, he said. I did not see any of that. And that's when he went more into his thoughts about Mr. Bagley.
So there's no question, though, is there, that the body of Christopher Bagley was put in your pickup truck and driven back to your place?
Zero question, no.
And eventually, you told investigators that you didn't hide the body, you didn't even know where it was.
Right.
And in fact, you said to the prosecution team in January 2020 that you were not going to bury a body in your own goddamn fucking yard.
That's correct. I would not do that.
And you told us yesterday that what Mr. Blahnik told you was that you needed to have some skin in the game.
Correct.
And that's why the body was in your yard.
Correct. I believe Paul Hoff and the defendant were both scared that I was going to go to the police or crack under pressure. And the defendant told me Paul Hoff wanted to kill me, and that was his way of sufficing Paul Hoff by having the body in my yard. Paul Hoff told me at a later date that it was actually the defendant that wanted to kill me, and that was their way of making sure that I stayed quiet.
When did you first tell the prosecution that there was that the reason that the body was buried in the backyard was because of Mr. Blahnik trying to save you?
I believe I told them that in March.
Well, you told them in March If they ask you if you would have buried the body in your backyard, you told them, I probably would have if my daughter wasn't there.
I told them at that point, when I was confronted with what I felt like my life was on the line, they asked me if I would have theoretically put the body in my yard. And I said, at that point, if I had no other options, maybe I would have, in fear for my life. My life was very much so on the line. And yes, my daughter being there would have stopped me from helping them at that point when I had felt like I had no other option.
Did you give that explanation to the prosecutors?
No, we never really got into my thought process on what happened. They just asked me, well, you would have helped them, correct? And I told them, yes, if it had come to that, and I had no other option, but my daughter was inside the house.
So it was going through your mind, but you didn't tell the prosecutors that?
A lot of goes through my mind that I didn't share with the prosecutors, correct?
Yeah, a lot going through your mind when you were questioned in February of 2019, didn't you?
Absolutely.
And a lot going through your mind when you were questioned by the government in January of 2020?
Yes, sir.
A lot going through your mind in March of 2020 when you were questioned under oath by the prosecutors?
Yes, sir.
A lot going through your mind today?
It would be weird if it wasn't.
Indeed. No other questions?
Yes, a few questions, Your Honor. Mr. Wagner, I want to ask you a few questions, some of which pertain to your testimony yesterday. Do you recall that line of questioning by the defense lawyer about whether or not any of the prosecutors had offered criticism to you about your testimony? You recall those questions?
Yes, I remember his question.
And did any of the prosecutors in this case criticize you over your testimony?
Never. It was actually me reaching out to the prosecutors, asking them if I did something wrong when the jury went to a recess. It was my confusion. I engaged the prosecutors in that question. They did not engage me.
And did you have a question about one of the words or terminologies used by the defense lawyer?
I had a question about when he was saying like embellishment, I believe. I didn't know what he meant by that.
But it's no secret, we met before you testified, right?
Yes, we did.
And did any of the prosecutors tell you what you should say during your testimony?
Never. The only thing the prosecution has ever told me is to tell the complete and total truth, no matter who is asking the question, whether it be the prosecution or the defense.
And is that what you have been trying to do yesterday and today?
Absolutely, 100%.
I want to ask you a few questions, sir, about your plea agreement. That is, your plea agreement where you pled guilty to 5 different charges in connection with the death of Chris Bagley, and really 3 different drug charges. Do you recall the questions about your plea arrangement?
Yes, I do.
And when you entered your guilty pleas in this case, at least with regard to the charges involving Chris Bagley, was it your understanding that your pleas only dealt with your role or your involvement in the killing and the other crimes having to do with Chris Bagley?
Yes, I felt like they dealt with my role because they were my plea and not the defendant's, so I think it would only pertain to my role in the crime.
And by pleading guilty to your involvement, were you trying to say something about Drew Blahnik's involvement by doing that?
No, only my involvement, that I was guilty, so I pled guilty.
And I think that you were asked some questions about whether, in fact, Chris Bagley provoked you during this episode. You recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
And was it, looking back on this, was it your feeling at the time that when the shoving match started, that Chris Bagley did provoke you into this shoving match?
Yes.
Did you see Chris Bagley do anything to either provoke the defendant, Drew Blahnik, or Paul Hoff?
Not one thing. Zero.
And even though you pled to these lesser charges, you are admitting, aren't you, that the extent of your involvement really warranted more serious charges, aren't you?
That is correct.
But you pled guilty to these charges for the reason you stated yesterday. You were willing to give something up and to testify, and not just testify in this case, but any other case that might involve the death of Chris Bagley. Is that
That is correct.
okay? And as far as the length of the sentence goes, I think you told everybody that based upon all the charges you pled guilty to, you were told that your sentence could be as long as 47 years, but there's a minimum of 10 years to it. Is that your understanding?
Correct.
Have you been given any kind of promises or assurances that the parole board is going to let you out after 10 years?
Zero. None.
Okay. And whenever you get out, is it your understanding that that's going to be a decision entirely up to the parole board?
Yeah, that would be based on the parole board. No lawyer or prosecution would have any involvement in that. That would be based mostly on, I believe, on my actions in prison.
During your shoving match with Chris Bagley, was there ever a time that Paul Hoff ever tried to intervene?
Never. Not once.
And just could you clarify, how are you holding Chris Bagley when the defendant intervened with the knife?
Chris was facing me, and I had him in a headlock.
And I think, was it your testimony you had him shoved up against the wall?
Yeah, we were up against, there was a barrier, yeah, wall.
Kind of, I think you said, did you say the bum rush, or how'd you phrase it?
Well, I bum rushed him, yes, charged him. And I had him up against the wall, and I turned him away from the wall.
And you think that that was the action that would have dislodged the gun that fell to the floor?
Correct.
During that whole encounter, was there ever a time when Chris Bagley ever reached for or produced a gun?
No, I did not see him reach for it or produce it. I didn't see it until it was on the ground, when I was turning him away from it.
And once it fell to the ground, did you think that it presented any risk at all or any harm to you?
No, I was a lot stronger than Chris. I had him in a pretty good underhook, and then I moved him away from it. I'm a pretty decent grappler, and there was no way he was going to get to the gun.
And when the gun fell to the floor, was that when Drew Blahnik yelled, "Gun, gun"?
It all happened so quick, simultaneously. It could have been a little bit before as well.
But during this entire encounter you had with Chris Bagley, during the shoving match and when you had him in a headlock, was there ever a time when you ever felt that you were in any kind of lethal danger from Chris Bagley?
No, I never really felt in any danger at all in my confrontation with Chris.
I think you said that initially when you first got to the trailer, I'm sorry, the first time that the two of you drove through the trailer court was because you were looking for Chris Bagley, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And the reason why you didn't stop was because you didn't see his vehicle.
Correct.
Okay. And that was the reason for the later call. You wanted to verify with Paul Hoff whether Chris in fact was there.
Correct.
And when Paul Hoff verified that he was, that was the reason for returning the second time.
Correct.
And when you actually entered the trailer, if I understand correctly, early on, you pulled Paul Hoff aside into a separate room because you wanted to gauge whether or not you were going to have any trouble from Hoff.
Correct.
And whatever was said, did you feel confident after talking to Hoff that he was not going to intervene?
100% confident.
And as you sit here today, do you know for sure how it was that Drew Blahnik found out that Chris Bagley might be at Paul Hoff's trailer?
No, we didn't know they were at the trailer. We knew they were together. Or he knew. And he, as the defense attorney made it state, by some bitch.
Regarding the knife that was used, I think you told us that when you first went over there, Blahnik did have a knife around his waist, is that right?
Yes, on his right hip.
And was it in a sheath?
Yes.
What was it again? You said, I think you described that he made some kind of motion towards...
Had his hand on his hip.
Okay. And how did that, I mean, what brought that to your attention that he was carrying a knife?
I saw it when he was at the house. It was pretty visible.
In the aftermath of the stabbing, did Drew Blahnik ever explain to you why he used a knife from the table rather than the knife that he had strapped to his waist?
No, probably just, it was easier, accessible, but those would just be guesses.
So that was just an assumption that you made. It was nothing that Drew Blahnik said?
Correct.
Okay. As far as the contents of the black gym bag, did you ever see what was in that bag?
No.
And what became of that bag?
Paul Hoff had it.
Do you know what he did with it?
Said later, I believe he took the contents out of it.
Earlier, you told us about Chris's body being placed in the back of your pickup truck.
Correct.
Were there any other items or articles that were taken with his body? Anything at all, any of his possessions, or just his body?
No, just his body. The only other articles that were in the back of the truck were pieces of plywood.
And were those pieces of plywood there previously, or were those from Hoff's trailer?
No, they were there previously.
Okay. I believe those are all the questions I have, sir. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Mr. Wagner, you just explained for us that in your conversations with the prosecution during the lunch break or during the recess yesterday, you asked them if you had done something wrong.
Correct.
And was there some insinuation by some suggestion that you had done something wrong?
No, it was just when answering a question, and then you guys, I believe, had a sidebar, and the jury left. And I'm not very familiar with court hearings or processes, so I didn't know if something I said or did had caused that.
So did you have a conversation with them during the noon hour?
Did I have, a conversation with them at the noon hour?
Yes.
I just quickly asked them that question.
If you had done something wrong?
Yes. And they told me, no, that's a normal, typical thing.
But you're here today to tell the complete and total truth.
Correct.
And that's the same thing you told the prosecutors on January 31,
Correct.
2020, right?
Correct. Yes.
It's the same thing you told them when you were under oath on March 31, 2020.
Correct.
In each of those instances, you said you were going to be absolutely 100% truthful.
That is correct.
To follow up on the questions about your plea agreement in this case, Mr. Bagley, Mr. Wagner, you were told that no assurance has been given to you about whether you were going to get out after 10 years or however many years. But You're aware of what good time is, aren't you?
Correct.
And tell the men and women of the jury what good time is.
I believe it's credited time that you get for every day that you serve.
Okay, so for every day you serve, you get a day off your sentence if you fulfill the requirements of good time.
I believe so.
So you know that the Department of Corrections, as soon as you enter the correctional facility, they count your time and give you your discharge date.
I believe so.
So if you go in on a 42-year sentence, assuming good time, the maximum they're going to keep you is 21 years.
Correct.
Even though you only have a mandatory minimum of 10, probably the maximum is, if you have good time, 21.
Correct.
And what's earned time?
I don't know what earned time is.
Finally, about the gun that Mr. Bagley had that night. It is true, is it not, Mr. Wagner, that you told the prosecutors on January 31, 2020, that you looked at him, you looked at the door, you looked at him, meaning Bagley, and immediately he's bending down to grab the gun. That's what you told them.
In January, yes.
And then you bum rushed him
Correct.
when you were being absolutely 100% truthful.
I was being about 50% truthful. I did look at him, I looked at the door, looked at him, and then decided to bum rush him. But there was no gun on the floor at that point.
No other questions?
Mr. Anderson, do you have further redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Step down, sir. State may call his next witness.
May we approach, Your Honor?
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a little hiccup getting folks here. We're going to take a 10-minute recess at this point in time. Remember, you're at judiciary recess. We'll come back at 10.
All rise. This Iowa District Court is in recess.
Mr. Hoffer, how many vehicles did Drew Wagner have when you were there, in late 2018?
He had several, like maybe 4 or 5.
Were they all running?
Yeah.
Thanks to your help, they were all running?
Yeah. I mean, it was just minor stuff I'd fix.
Okay. And the work
Let me have it back just a tiny bit.
the work that you were doing in the basement, was this electrical work?
Yeah.
Was the framing already up so you could
Yeah.
install outlets and run the wiring and
Yep.
all according to code?
Yes.
Okay. Did you see Mr. Blahnik over there working on the house?
I seen him over there, but I wasn't there
Okay.
when he was working on it.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffner. Those are all the questions I have for you.
Mr. Herder, do you have your redirect?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
May I excuse this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Keys? May I excuse the witness?
You may, thank you.
Sir, you're excused if you're under subpoena in our release. And I correct counsel, we now need to take that recess we discussed previously. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a matter I need to take up outside the presence of the lawyers. I'm going to now take a recess. We're going to shoot for about 15 or 20 minutes, let's say, come back
Yes, sir.
So please state and spell your full name for the record.
Paul Hoff, Paulhoff.
Your witness, Ms. Slaughter.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Hoff.
Good morning.
How old are you?
42.
Mr. Hoff, you're in an orange jumpsuit. Are you currently incarcerated?
Yes, ma'am. I'm currently housed in Lynn County Jail.
And I just want to bring this to your attention. We want to make sure we can hear you. So if you need to pull that closer to you or move closer to it, the one with the red light on, okay? You said you're currently incarcerated in the Lynn County Jail.
Yes, ma'am.
Were you brought here to Lynn County on a writ specifically by the state to testify in this trial?
Yes, ma'am. I was brought from federal prison.
And where are you currently incarcerated?
In the FBOP, I'm housed at Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pennsylvania.
And when you say FBOP, is that Federal Bureau of Prisons?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hoff, is this the first time that you've been incarcerated?
No, it's not.
When was the first time you got locked up?
What do you mean, like adult prison?
Were you locked up as a juvenile?
Yes, ma'am.
When was the first time you got locked up as a juvenile?
I was 11 years old.
And where was that?
Cromwell Children Unit in Independence.
Could you say that again?
Cromwell Children Unit in Independence, Iowa.
What about after that?
Again, at Quakerdale Group Home in Waterloo.
Still as a juvenile?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you locked up after that?
Yes.
When?
I went to the State Training School for Boys in Eldora, Iowa.
Then when?
And then I went to prison in Oklahoma.
What type of prison was that, state or federal?
It was a state prison.
How long did you do in Oklahoma incarcerated?
Approximately 11 years.
What was your charge down there, Mr. Hoff?
Possession with intent marijuana.
Said you did 11 years. When did you get out?
October of 2011.
And how long were you out of custody at that point? Or how long were you out of custody before you got locked up again?
Approximately 14 months.
You went back to jail?
Yes.
Did you go to prison?
Yes.
And where was that?
Iowa prison. I went to Anamosa and then Fort Madison.
And how long did you do in Anamosa and then in Fort Madison?
Altogether, I think it was about 5 years.
Can you tell us what you were locked up for that put you in prison in Anamosa and then to Fort Madison?
It was intimidation with a weapon,
And what was that weapon?
a firearm.
When you went from Anamosa to Fort Madison, was that all for the same case?
Yes.
Just transferred prisons?
Yeah, disciplinary, got in trouble.
When you got out of Fort Madison, how long were you out?
About 15 months.
And then what?
And I was arrested on this indictment, or on a federal indictment for a firearm charge.
Mr. Hoff, I want to draw your attention to February 18th of 2019. Is that date familiar to you?
Yes, ma'am.
And why is that date familiar to you?
That was the day that I was I was pursued by law enforcement and arrested.
On February 18th of 2019, did you have an active federal warrant outstanding for you?
Yeah, I believe there was a criminal complaint in federal court.
And what were you charged with in that criminal complaint?
Possession of a firearm.
As a felon?
Yes, ma'am.
Anything else?
I was later charged with some stuff that I had on me when I was arrested. Initially, it was a criminal complaint for the firearm of a previous case, and then I was arrested that day with more firearms and some drugs.
Let's make that make sense. So the investigation for these federal charges initially stemmed from an incident that happened when?
I think it was in about August of 2018.
Okay? And so the complaint that was filed for the possession of a firearm was related to the investigation that had been going on since, I'm going to say, mid-2018.
Right.
Okay? So how did, on February 18th of 2019, you come to be in contact with law enforcement again?
They initially tried to pull me over. I believe they already had the criminal complaint and was pursuing me. They found out where I was and tried to pull me over. I tried to elude, and
You say they tried to pull you over, you tried to elude, you went on a high-speed chase?
yes.
Okay. And how did that chase come to an end?
I stopped. It was deep snow on the ground that year, and it was, I pulled off to the side. The streets were still real deep with snow, and I was trying not to crash out, so I pulled off on the side. Once I got away from the officers, I pulled over and tried to hide, but then they spotted me and pulled up to me.
Okay. And when they spotted you and pulled up to you, did you go into custody quietly?
No.
They had to tase you?
Yeah, I was trying to get away. I was going from drive to reverse because I was stuck in the snowbank, and they ended up busting the window and shooting me with the taser.
And that got you under control?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Hoff, what were you driving that day?
A Tahoe, 07 Tahoe.
After you were arrested, was your vehicle searched?
Yes.
And what was found in your vehicle?
2 firearms and a bag of methamphetamine.
How much methamphetamine?
138 grams.
Is meth all they found?
No.
What else did they find?
I also found marijuana, cocaine, heroin.
How much marijuana?
I think approximately 1 ounce.
How many grams is 1 ounce?
28 grams.
You said meth, weed, heroin?
Yes.
How much heroin we're talking?
A couple grams.
And what else was in there?
About 5 grams of cocaine, I think.
And you said you had 2 guns.
Yes, ma'am.
What kind of guns were they?
I had a Sig Sauer P329, and I had a Ruger GP100 revolver.
Where were you taken, or where were you placed into custody following that arrest?
Initially, I was taken to the Lynn County Sheriff's Office.
And just to be clear, have you been in custody continuously since you were arrested on February 18th of 2019?
Yes, ma'am.
And you say you were taken initially to the Lynn County Sheriff's Office,
Yes, ma'am.
and then following that to the Lynn County Jail?
Yes.
Mr. Hoff, were you involved in a proffer interview on February 22nd of 2019?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And what is your understanding of what a proffer interview is?
If you cooperate with authorities and they do a proffer interview, you basically lay everything on the line, whatever it is part of an agreement, so you won't be charged with all these other crimes.
So when you get to the Lynn County Sheriff's Office, do Lynn County sheriffs, detectives, investigators, are they attempting to interview you?
No. Initially, they asked to talk, and I told them I wouldn't talk to the sheriff,
Who did you say you would talk to?
the FBI agent, or a U.S. attorney.
And did you in fact request multiple times to speak to a United States attorney?
Yes.
And just to be clear, is that a federal prosecutor?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you then granted access to a federal prosecutor?
No. FBI agent came, Mike Kitzmiller, came and interviewed me.
And did this interview happen on February 18th?
Yes, it did.
During the interview, was one of the topics of conversation the death investigation, or at that time, missing persons investigation for Christopher Bagley?
Yes, ma'am.
So during that interview, did you give a statement to Agent Kitzmiller?
Yeah, yes.
What happens after you give that statement?
I gave a partial statement, and we stopped, and he said that he was going to have the U.S. attorney come talk to me.
So when you say a partial statement, did you stop the interview, or did Agent Kitzmiller?
I stopped the interview
And why?
because he couldn't give me no guarantees that I was seeking.
So gave him enough to pique the interest.
To show him that I knew what I was talking about, yeah.
The proffer that then took place February 22nd, was that as a result of that partial interview you gave with Agent Kitzmiller?
Yes, ma'am. That was with United States Attorney Tony Morfitt, Iowa DCI agent, some Lynn County Sheriff Deputy investigators.
You?
Me, yeah, and
Who's your-
my attorney.
Mr. Hoff, when you started this proffer interview, was it explained to you what the expectations of you were going into that interview?
Yes,
And who explained those expectations to you?
the U.S. Attorney Tony Morfitt.
And can you tell us what you interpreted as the expectations that were had for you?
Just to be truthful and to tell exactly what the truth. Basically, if you put it out there and you tell the truth during the proffer interview, it can't later be used against you.
When you entered into this proffer interview, were you promised anything prior to giving your statement to the attorney, to the law enforcement?
No.
Were you specifically told, in fact, there is no agreement?
Yes. I was told there was no guarantee that it was possible that I could get, leniency on the charges that was against me. But they don't make no deal. They say there's no deal is made as far as I'm not guaranteed anything.
When you give or participate in one of these proffer interviews, can you tell us what the format of that interview is? And by format, is it you just giving a narrative? Is it question answer?
It's some questions, but then basically it's my I tell what I have to say, and they like, okay, but what about this, or ask about specific days, specific things, and then I tell my part of it.
Mr. Hoff, the charges that you were arrested for in February of 2019, being your August incident and then the incident that stemmed out of the day of the actual arrest, have you since then entered pleas of guilty to charges related to those two offenses?
Yes, ma'am.
And what specific counts or charges did you plead guilty to?
I pled guilty to possession with intent to distribute methamphetamine and possession of a firearm in the furtherance of a drug trafficking crime.
When you enter a plea of guilty in federal court, are you told up front what your sentence is going to be?
Not exactly. You get a guideline, approximate. You know, you get from this many months to this many months, somewhere in between. That's just a guideline. It's not a guarantee. Each specific charge, you know, carries so much time. Possession of methamphetamine with intent, 50 to 150 grams, was 5 to 40. Possession of a firearm in the furtherance of drug trafficking crime is 5 to life.
And when you say 5 to 40, we're talking years.
Correct.
5 to life, 5 years to life in prison.
Correct.
So your initial charges, you were facing a significant amount of time.
Yes.
And when you enter into the plea agreement, are you given a range? As you said, not specifically, right? You're not specifically told.
Right.
So are you given a range that, you know, this is what we're assuming your sentence is going to be?
Correct.
When you entered into your plea agreement or pled guilty, what range were you anticipated to receive as a sentence for your guilty plea?
Initially, when they give you your guidelines, it's prior to an investigation that's done by the federal probation office. After that, then they determine, are you a career offender, are you several other factors, and then that is what ultimately decides your guideline range. My guidelines at that point was 262 to 327 months.
And when you say 262 months, how many years is that?
I think it's like 22 years and a few months.
And the other number you said was 300 what?
327.
And 327 divided by 12 is what?
27 years and a few months.
Okay. And what is your understanding of the minimum amount of time that you would have to serve on any federal sentence before you became eligible for parole?
There's no federal parole. You do 85% of your sentence before you're eligible for a halfway house or a home confinement, but they don't do federal parole.
So at 22 and some odd years before you could get out, you got to do 85% of that. Is that a yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hoff, I know you testified that initially when you gave your partial interview to the FBI agent that the disappearance and or homicide investigation of Christopher Bagley was a topic of conversation. Was that also a primary topic of conversation during your proffer interview?
Yes, it was.
So you knew Christopher Bagley?
Yes, I did.
Can you recall, Mr. Hoff, when you met him?
I think it was about May or June of 2018.
And where did you meet him at?
A friend of mine, Tommy Ayers' house.
Tommy who?
Ayers.
Do you know how to spell Ayers?
No, I don't.
Under what circumstances did you come to meet him, come to be at Tommy Ayers' place?
I was selling meth at the time, and I just met him in business. I would be there selling drugs at Tommy's house, and he would come over and he was selling marijuana, and sometimes he would trade me marijuana for meth, or
Vice versa?
buy meth, or I'd buy marijuana from him, yes.
And so initially, how would you describe the nature of your relationship with Christopher Bagley?
It was just business. We did know a lot of the same friends, so we'd sit and get high together. We'd sit and, drink, hang out while we was there. Mostly it was just business, though.
And when you say business, we're talking meth, marijuana, drugs.
Yes.
Any other business that you and he did together?
Oh.
Mr. Hoff, I know that you said and have said a couple times that you sold drugs.
Yes.
Was your primary drug that you sold methamphetamine?
Yes, it was.
And did you sell other drugs?
Yes.
What other drugs did you sell?
Marijuana, heroin, cocaine.
But meth was your primary product?
Yes.
Can you give us an idea on what type of scale you sold drugs at? Like, how much are we talking?
I would go through a pound of meth every 3-4 days.
And what's the street value of a pound of methamphetamine?
Approximately 10,000.
Mr. Hoff, in your experience, do most meth addicts also use marijuana and or heroin?
Yes.
Can you explain why?
Meth, you get, it makes you hyper, it makes you alert, it makes you super anxious, and a lot of times people will smoke marijuana to curb that effect of it.
Same with the heroin?
Yes,
So it's a downer to counteract the meth?
right. A lot of people I know that did heroin also with the meth, they'd be up so long on meth and then do the heroin to go to sleep.
Mr. Hoff, you've told us that you were heavily involved in the sale of methamphetamine and other drugs. Did you also use drugs?
Yes,
And what was your drug of choice?
meth.
Did you use any of the other stuff?
Occasionally, yes.
And what other stuff did you use?
I would snort coke, and I would do heroin sometimes. I smoke marijuana every day.
Every day?
Yeah.
Back in 2018, was there ever a day that you didn't use some sort of drug?
No.
And was that generally meth and marijuana every day?
Yes.
When you were using methamphetamine back in 2018, can you tell us approximately how much of that you would ingest or consume daily?
I wouldn't even really know. I mean, I was shooting meth, so I would shoot it, and then I would also, as I go around to people's houses and I'm selling drugs, I would smoke with everybody all day. So some grams, I guess. I would say a few grams a day.
Just to be clear, when you say you were shooting meth, what does that mean?
I was injecting meth with a needle
And where'd you inject that into your body?
in my arms.
And then you'd also smoke the meth
Right.
and then marijuana. Was your normal state of mind high?
Yes.
Spent more time high than sober?
Absolutely.
The drug business or the business that you were involved in with Christopher Bagley, was that the extent of you and his relationship?
Initially, yes. But later on, we started hanging out more and more.
Can you recall when the transition was from your drug relationship, business relationship, into a friendship?
It's hard to pin the exact time, but I would say a couple months into it, say by September maybe.
And how did that come to be? What changed where you decided it's not just going to be about business anymore?
Well, we were hanging out so much, we were meeting so much that we started, it became more than business as far as, being friends. It just, once you're hanging out with somebody so much, you start really, you like the person or you don't, and I liked him. He was fun.
What kinds of things did you and he do in your friendship?
Mostly just hang out. We ran around with a lot of different girls together. He had several girlfriends. I had several girlfriends. We'd go do things together with different girls and
Party. At the end of 2018, actually, let me ask it differently. From the time you and he met, summer 2018, to the time of his death in 2018, how often were you and he hanging out?
Daily at the end. Almost daily. There would be some days that I wouldn't see him, but that was rare. Either we'd be just hanging out or, at the end I wasn't necessarily getting my marijuana from him, but he was still getting meth from me, which was almost daily.
And when he'd come get meth, it wasn't a quick stop by?
No, we would hang out.
For hours?
Sometimes.
Your Honor, may I approach, or may we approach?